We're going to begin this class by talking a little bit about the history of child maltreatment. And history seems like kind of a weird word at this moment because maltreatment has probably occurred throughout history, throughout human history. But the history of the definitions of child maltreatment and how our views about raising children and how children should be treated, how they've changed over time is important to consider. Before we do that, though, let's just take a little snapshot picture at the problem, the issue that we're talking about in this class. First of all, let's talk about how many children per year are victimized, are victims of child maltreatment. Now, mind you, this is a little difficult to figure out because you're trying to, there's probably a lot of maltreatment that goes unnoticed, unreported. What we have here is a child maltreatment rate which includes reported cases of abuse. And I think you can see why that's a problem using reported cases. But I think what we can see from this particular chart is that the rates of maltreatment have varied over time. What you can see pretty clearly is that in the early 90s, like 92, 93, 94, 95, the rates of maltreatment were much higher than you see today. And this is true of a lot of social problems that were around. So when we look at drug use or we look at teen pregnancy or juvenile delinquency, you see the same kind of trend. In the early 90s, it was at its highest rate, but you're seeing that it's going down. You also notice that at about 2004, we figured out a way to include unique counts of child victimization, not duplicate counts, so that we have a sense of how many new children or unique children are being abused. And you can see that as of 2015, it's about 9.2 children out of every 1,000 children that is being abused. If you multiply that out into how many children are in the United States, it's quite a few children. Okay? Let's take a look at a slightly different chart. This is child fatalities. And these are the numbers of children who die each year because of abuse, neglect. And what you can see is, unlike the previous numbers that we looked at, the number of fatalities is actually increasing. In fact, if you think about it, in 2016, for example, there were 1,750 child abuse fatalities, which is about 5 children per day dying at the hands of their caretakers. We also think that these numbers might be actually a little bit higher because some states do a better job of keeping track of child fatalities than other states. So this is 2.25 children out of every 100,000 children. Okay, so it's a slightly different metric. But that gives you an idea of the scope of the problem. In this class, we're going to be talking about many different forms of maltreatment, and we'll be going over all of these forms in more depth as we go through the class. But the most common type of child abuse, and when I say common, it's the most commonly, when we talk about child maltreatment, people typically think about physical abuse. Okay? So physical abuse, we will be talking about child sexual abuse, child neglect, psychological maltreatment. These are 4 separate but very large areas of abuse that we're going to be covering in much more detail. When you look at this list, think to yourself, what do you think is the most common form of child maltreatment? Which do you think is the least common? And also think maybe which might cause the most harm to a child and which might cause the least harm. You might make a note of your predictions today and see if they actually match with what you find out in the class. But I'm going to answer one of those questions right now. Which is the most common form of maltreatment? And again, I'll share some data with you. Here is again, coming from the federal government, kind of parsing apart the different types of child abuse. For those of you that thought neglect was the most common, absolutely, you're totally right. neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment. You see physical abuse is next, and the category of other, which is probably people who engage in multiple forms of child abuse, so who do neglect and physically abuse their children. You see that sexual abuse then comes next, and psychological maltreatment is the least. But I want to caution you, although psychological maltreatment looks like it's the least common, it's probably the most common form of child abuse. It's just the type of maltreatment that's less likely to get reported to authorities. And you'll find out more about this when we get there, okay? And if you notice there's a small little sliver there that says medical neglect. That's actually neglect. It's a form of neglect. So you'd have to add that into the 78% of neglect. So you can see that some form of neglect is the most common type. Okay, so there's a snapshot of our country today, or as close to today as I could possibly get. But now let's talk about the historical piece. So let's talk about how we as a society determine which conditions in our society are social problems. If you look at history, you see that child maltreatment was a social condition long before it was defined as a social problem. And what does that mean? It means that it existed long before we thought it was a problem. And you might say to yourself, well, how could we not think child maltreatment is a problem? Not a problem. Of course it's a problem. The fact is that for a very long time in our history, the way that parents treated their children, whatever they did, was not defined by the culture. So let me introduce a term to you. This is a term that sociologists often use. It's called social constructionism. Social constructionism is the process by which social conditions become redefined as social problems. So there are things that exist in our society that at some point people start saying, you know, this is wrong. This is a problem. Okay? So what has to happen in social construction is society, the people in society have to start saying, this is wrong, okay? This is a social condition, but it's not a condition that we think is good. It's a social problem, okay? And what happens when we have a process of social constructionism going on is there are people that make claims, and it's the process that is often called claims making. They make claims. This is a problem. Parents shouldn't do this to their children. Parents should treat their children better. We need to keep track of this as a society. So as more and more people make the same claims, the social condition is now being redefined as a social problem. And what you often see is the early people making the claims are what we call moral entrepreneurs. These are individual citizens. They could be religious groups. They could be social movements or organizations that call society, sort of a call to arms. This is a problem that we need to fix. You can see this happening right now with more and more moral entrepreneurs, especially very young people, talking about the issues of climate change. And what happens in social constructionism is if enough people start making these claims, and as those claims become accepted, yes, this is a social problem, then the condition gets redefined into a problem. Make sense? Okay? So the process of redefinition starts when at least one group claims that there's a problem. As more and more groups level the same claims, it starts to be defined as a problem. So you can see then the way that we define child maltreatment is defined by society. So we say, this is a problem, this is right, this is wrong. And so societies then make conditions their problems. Now I want to compare this constructionism to what's called relativism. So you're tempted to say that if a society decides that something is a problem, we should allow society to define its problems. And most relativists would agree with you. So social construction and relativism, they're kind of cousins in a sense, but it's a difficult place to be, because what we're saying is, if a culture defines this as being okay, then it is okay, because many of the social problems are simply social constructions. So relativists then might say, hey, moral decisions are decided by the historical and cultural context. It's not our place to judge those 50 and 60 years ago if something was completely acceptable back then. Also, by today's standards, we shouldn't judge another culture for their treatment of children, because they haven't defined that as a problem. So you can see there might be some tension between construction and relativism. Think about, let me give you a couple of examples that might bring this to mind. Let's take a historical example first. So if we were to do a survey today in the 21st century and say something about corporal punishment, that's a perfect example. What if we asked people, is it okay to spank your child with a belt? Take the belt off of your pants and give your child and whoop your child with a belt. What do you think people would say? I think the vast majority would say, no, that's totally inappropriate to hit a child with a belt. However, in the 1960s, that wasn't true. And in fact, many parents, including my parents, used a belt when punishing their children. So you see, the culture has changed, and so we now consider using a belt on a child a social problem, whereas it was accepted before. And the question is it okay that in the 1960s they did it? Maybe it wasn't okay, but a relativist would say it was okay within that culture. Okay? Now let me give you a modern example to show you how uncomfortable it can be to be a constructionist and a relativist, and how to balance the two. So for example, a modern example is that many African countries practice female genital mutilation. It's part of their culture, it's what they do, it fits with their religious beliefs. However, many of us are repulsed by this idea of female genital mutilation. And in fact, there are many places in the States where they have large immigrant communities where this practice is banned. So in some senses, what we're saying as Americans is we are not relativists when it comes to this. We don't care what your culture believes in. We just find this repulsive, and we're going to say that this is a problem. So you can see that there's always tension between being, understanding that society constructs its problems and actually being able to say, well, there's some things that we're just going to say are wrong, period. Okay, so let me share with you, just to take an example here, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children, which was adopted a document a long time ago. And I don't want you to judge the document, but I want you to think of the United Nations. Are they being relativists or not on the rights of a child? So before going further, you know that the United Nations cannot set laws or anything like that, but this is just recommendations for countries. So their recommendation was that countries should practice non-discrimination, treat all children the same, that laws and policies should be in the best interests of children, that laws and policies of countries should consider the physical and emotional development of the child, what is good for that child at that time, and that we should consider children's opinions and views in matters that concern them. Okay? So what do you think? Are they being relativistic, or are they making a designation? I think we could safely say that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is definitely not relativistic. It's not saying each country should decide for themselves what's right and wrong. What they're saying is, no, this is what's right and wrong. So there's a great example when you're looking at different organizations and how they define things. Okay, so we've got the bones here for looking at our history. Let's talk a little bit about the history of childhood. Prior to the 15th century, humankind was pretty indifferent to children. They were small versions of their parents. They weren't in need of any kind of special protection. In the times before the 15th century, parents could sell their children, or if they didn't want a child, they might drop the child off at a monastery. So there wasn't any push or requirement for parents to treat children in a particular way. But during the 15th century through the 18th, we're talking about 15th being the Renaissance. During that time, we discovered childhood, and when I say we discovered it, I mean we literally discovered it. We started thinking of children as being separate and special human beings. You saw at that time the first pediatric books coming out. Medical doctors need to think of children differently. Children were given pet names. They were given special clothing that was for children. If you look at artists' renderings of children before the 15th century, you see that children wore clothing pretty much that looked like adult clothing. But afterwards, you see that children have their own special clothing. There was a couple of very famous philosophers, John Locke and Rousseau, at that time, who really emphasized childhood. So John Locke, he is the philosopher who said that we were born empty, tabula rasa, an empty slate, and everything that we become is written from childhood on. And of course we had Rousseau, who talked about the innocence of children, and so that they are innocent, and so they need to be kept from things. This is when we started talking about that children need to be protected from certain topics like sex. Before then, you didn't have that push. Moving forward into the 19th and 20th centuries, we moved even further. We moved from a discovery of childhood to a preoccupation with childhood. You have books on parenting books on how to bring up your children, how to make them perfect. Dr. Seuss became very popular, telling parents how to raise a good child. There were changes in our laws. We had juvenile courts, special for children, educational systems that were mandatory, and child protection laws. So we went from an indifference of childhood to a preoccupation with children. You see the same kind of history with the history of child maltreatment. In ancient history, there are numerous examples of abusive practices towards children that were widely accepted and reported. So, for example, there are many references in the Bible made to infanticide. And history shows that many cultures supported infanticide in one way or another. There were many cultures that allowed fathers, for example, in Roman culture or in Scandinavian culture actually, that allowed fathers to accept or reject a child. So when a child was born, if a father took the babe in his arms, the child could be fed and baptized. And if the father rejected the child was left to die. Okay? He was left to die, he or she. So this practice, by the way, was legal in Sweden until 1731, and it was legal in Denmark as late as 1850. So this condition was not considered a problem until the 1700s. Okay? So there's frequent references to infanticide. Another type of infanticide is also mentioned in the Bible. In the Bible, there is a point at which the curse of Joshua says that if someone wanted to rebuild the town that was completely demolished, they have to lay the foundation thereof on his firstborn. So what it says is that he pronounced the solemn oath. He cursed anyone who tried to rebuild Jericho. And he's saying that if you try to rebuild Jericho, you must put the foundations on your firstborn. And he specifically said your firstborn son. Okay? And then your youngest child had to be set up at its gates. In other words, you inter a live child or kill a child, and you put their body under the foundation of these buildings. Now that may seem kind of crazy to you, but this in fact was a practice of interring live newborns in the foundations of buildings and bridges across the centuries. Okay? Archaeological digs of the biblical era in Canaanite dwellings reveal jars of infant bones found in the foundations of houses. This was a practice that was very common, and it was outlawed in Europe during the 17th century, and it was outlawed in India during the 20th century. So you see then that this practice was pretty common for a very long time until it was called a problem. You can also see instances of child maltreatment in ancient Greece and Rome. Sexual abuse of children was pretty common, and it was condoned. In fact, young boys were often given to men, older men, for training. And young boys would be trained by an older man in combat or in some skill. But part of that training included sexual training, and that mentor was likely to have sex with that young man. And that was completely condoned. That was completely okay. So even Aristotle supported this. Here's a quote from Aristotle. "The justice of a master or father is a different thing from that of citizen, for a son or a slave are property, and there can be no injustice to one's own property." What is he saying there? He's saying the justice of a master, so that's the mentor or a father. So the children who have been given to a master or a father are property of these two people, and there is nothing that they could do that would be wrong to that property. So you see how completely children were at the mercy of the adults, and nothing in their societies suggested that this was a problem. Moving on, in the Middle Ages, there was widespread poverty, which made children a liability. They were given to monasteries. They were often beggars, and they might be sold, they might be mutilated in order to make them more effective. Beggars, they were often abandoned or sold. So there was no accounting for children during the Middle Ages. There was also some cultures sacrificed children in order to ensure a good harvest. So there was a very a neglect of child welfare and a lack of interest in it. And I'm moving pretty quickly here, but we're moving into the Industrial Revolution. You started to see institutional abuse, not just simply familial abuse, but institutional abuse from labor and education. Here's a picture of a schoolmaster, and you may not be able to see what he's holding in his hands here. Can you see this right here? These were birch rods. Okay, so basically you go off, cut some switches off of a tree, peel the twigs off of it, and grab a bunch. And those birch rods were used by headmasters to beat their students. And students, if they didn't pay attention, could be hit with this batch of birch rods. In fact, the symbol for education originally was a book it was an open book with birch rods across it. So that's how ingrained the abuse of children was within the educational system. By the 17th century, abusive practices were very rampant in the educational process, and that didn't end until the mid-20th century. And the interesting thing about this type of abuse is that social class did not protect you from this abuse. In fact, children who were sent to boarding schools were often abused even worse than other children. The labor market also was very abusive to children. Here you have a picture of a child who's a coal miner, and you see the very narrow tunnels, and they were asked to crawl through these tunnels and pull the coal up to the surface. And here's a rather famous picture of a bunch of coal miners who I think we would all agree are far too young to be mining coal. And of course it exposed them to hazardous conditions and all kinds of diseases as well. Another one that yielded or resulted in a lot of disease was the chimney sweeps in early America and in England. You know, you send boys down the chimney to clean it. Unfortunately, they had very high rates of testicular cancer from their exposure to all of the soot in the chimneys. Now, you might say that these are not issues that we deal with today, but in fact, that's not true. We're still talking about some of these issues with regard to children, like where they should be and where they shouldn't be in our labor force. So I'm going to share with you this rather short video, about a 7-minute video, talking about a different kind of issue today.
We like to think of agriculture as good, clean, outside work, something healthy and wholesome and outdoors, and kids working for their families' farms and helping out when they can. The reality is today, farm work is something completely different.
I started working when I was 11 years old.
It feels like you don't got no choices. You don't feel the same as other kids.
There are hundreds of thousands of children working on U.S. farms, and many kids who are working on large commercial farms. The child labor law in the U.S. is pretty good, except when it comes to agriculture, and then it has a big gaping hole. U.S. law allows children to work in agriculture at far younger ages for unlimited hours outside of school in much more dangerous conditions than any other sector. So a child can work perfectly legally for any farmer at age 12. That child couldn't work serving the food, but he can work 10, 12, 14 hours picking. Farm work is actually the most dangerous occupation that's open to kids in the U.S. in terms of fatalities. Kids are working with dangerous and sharp tools, doing work that may require them to be bent down for hours. I've talked to kids who've worked in 14 states around the U.S., and kids told me about the toll that this work takes on their bodies.
The airplane flew over the field and began spraying on the field, and I didn't know what the spray contained or what it was. The drift was coming towards our field because it was windy, and I'm thinking, oh, it's just water, they're making the crops grow better.
Now, pesticide exposure isn't good for any farm workers, but it's especially bad for children whose bodies are still developing. Farm worker families are typically very, very poor, and kids told me that they worked in order to put food on the table or to fix the family's truck or to pay the phone bill. Kids are working because their families really need the money. When children work so many hours during school and over the summers, it really hurts their education. Kids who migrate leave school early and go back to school late, missing weeks or months of school every year. These kids are from Texas, where school started 3 days ago. Now, some of these kids will enroll in Michigan schools when those start up in a couple of weeks. Others will just wait till they get back down to Texas.
It was hard to catch up in school. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for me because sometimes I'll be there in class and my friends know everything I didn't know. And it was hard, and sometimes I feel like embarrassed because I never catch up with them.
Kids are also working because it's legal. U.S. law presents it as a legitimate choice for families to send their kids out to work, and employers are free to hire them. Do they pay each person?
Yeah, they pay us each person.
Yeah, so even like your 12-year-old daughter is going to make.
They pay her.
by the
Yeah,
hour.
they pay her. Like she's 12, so he probably won't make the check under her name because she doesn't have any ID or anything to cash the check, so that he'll just probably put it in my check.
The Fair Labor Standards Act is U.S. federal law that, among other things, prohibits child labor. But when the law was passed, a big exception was left for agriculture. In 1938, a lot of Americans lived on family farms, and far fewer Americans graduated from high school or needed a high school diploma. Today, the picture is different, but the loophole remains.
It's not right that these kids, and including me, that I lost my childhood and other children should lose their childhood as well.
When I turned 14, that's when I dropped out from school and went to the strawberries in Florida. And then we came back to Ohio and started working on the pickles, harvesting. But it really hasn't been easy.
Right now, there's a bill pending in Congress called the CARE Act. It's a bill that would amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to apply the same rules to kids working in agriculture as kids working in any other sector. A lot of people walked beans or detasseled corn or did other kinds of farm work when they were teenagers. But the CARE bill is about protecting the most vulnerable kids. Not kids who are doing chores, but young kids who are working for such long hours and compromising their health and their education.
So you can see that the issue of child labor is still a concern today. I want to mention that this film is a little bit older and the CARE Act was not passed by Congress, so children are still subjected to this kind of thing. I'm going to stop right here and we'll pick up again with this short history lesson next time. Thank you.